Hi, my name's Rachel Paskett. My pronouns are she, her. I am a master's student at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. I'm just about to finish my master's in cultural analysis and social theory. So I'm fairly new to video game studies, but my background in queer and crip theory overlap well, and I've been found a new way to discuss heteronormativity in our institutions there. And then I met Christine through this conference, and I'll pass it over to her to.
Hi there, Christine Tomlinson. I'm a lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm also a game studies specialist with the Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University. Tend to prefer name instead of pronouns, but name they works. And yes, I do a lot of things about player experience, game content, how players interpret and experience that game content, and what types of cultural information and attributes are sent via games.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And as this is a round table, if people want to put questions or raise their hands during the chat, that's absolutely fine, and we will get to you. I suppose as a starting point, which I don't know if this is an easy or a hard question, you can decide yourselves. We're focusing on non-binary and asexual representation in video games. So how has that historically looked in video games, I suppose, would be a good starting point.
Rachel, do you want to take this, or do you want me to?
I think this was great with your little intro you prepared.
Yeah, so I do want to thank the previous presenters because they've laid a lot of the groundwork for a lot of the things that we need to cover with representation. Historically, representation in video games, particularly when we think about non-binary and asexual characters, has not been ideal. And I want to also thank PS for kind of highlighting this idea that queer studies does tend to focus a lot on sort of gay experiences and gay content, which we do see coming through quite a bit when we're grappling with sexuality and gender. There are certain areas that have remained pretty unexplored or underexplored in video games, particularly in the AAA space. And there is actually recent work that has actually highlighted that gender nonconforming characters have decreased in recent games, which is sort of an interesting shift. But ultimately, what we see is a lot of emphasis on heteronormativity, heterosexuality, and I do want to also highlight Carlos, I believe it was, who mentioned the gay button. A lot of the time, sexuality becomes this button that people can press, and it's an opt-in experience for sexuality in games. Hopefully that kind of addresses your question there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Rachel, your own thoughts?
Could you remind me of the question again?
Oh, I was just asking about your thoughts on how asexuality and non-binary identities have been represented in video games so far.
Yeah, so I agree with Christine and her points there. And I think video games traditionally offer character customization in adherence to binary categorizations of gender. So I've done a lot of work with the game Story of Seasons, Pioneers of Olive Town, that with its new release, it doesn't categorize gender through binaries. It breaks up character customization through larger categories rather than just like feminine characteristics and masculine characteristics. So I've kind of been doing some work that troubles the idea that there is a history of a lack of representation where there is ways that queerness is in games and queerness is circulating through games as we feel queerness kind of as an affect.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. If I can go back to Christine then, and I know that in your original submission, you were talking a lot about the fans' unease with asexuality, was it in particular? I might be getting that wrong. I was just wondering if you wanted to say anything on that. I know you were concentrating on Dragon Age in particular, and asexuality within it. The question I was wondering about it was, with mentioning a lot of fans' unease around it, how has that kind of manifested?
Yeah, and it through conversations with Rachel, we actually kind of pulled in another one of my projects, if I'm okay to touch on that as well as part of this.
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
So speaking to Dragon Age Inquisition specifically, it's sort of this interesting case because you have a situation where these games tend to highlight sexuality in pretty direct ways. People explore sexuality as part of personality, part of identity. And Cole is a really interesting character in the context of the most recent game in the series, because Cole is presented as very much asexual, aromantic, not really interested or engaging in these things. And the players find this out by listening to conversations that characters are having around Cole and Cole's interests and personality and identity. But in an expansion to the game, they actually end up effectively erasing that entire identity. And a lot of players were a little bit uncomfortable with that because you had a lot of players that were saying, oh, well, there's this character that I'm reading as asexual. This is refreshing because we never see this kind of representation, or people who could relate to it or identify with having an asexual character in this game felt very let down by that change. And so that's kind of what I was getting at with that sense of unease, the ease with which Dragon Age just kind of removed this very rare representation. Um, and it's sort of interesting in the context of the things that were discussed earlier in the conference as well. The fact that you do have some sexualities that are effectively hidden in games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age. You have to tap into it as the player by exploring things very directly. And just to throw in another element of asexuality and player experience, I was also bringing in some of my work on Lovelink, which is a dating sim mobile app kind of game. A lot of players who are asexual feel like they can't fully express themselves or explore this game because it is very heavily emphasizing sex and sexuality as part of romantic relationships, which is sort of an other end of that experience of representation and how things can be limited in terms of queer expressions and experience for players expressing their physical world identities in a game.
Yeah, I suppose that's where my thoughts always would be in terms of the relationship between representation in the game versus the role that the player has when they are interacting with it, which I think is quite interesting. Rachel, I know that you as well were thinking about the relationship between player and game. And the thing I was wondering about was in terms of challenging heterosexuality, what role do you see the game versus the player in doing that throughout the experience of playing one?
This is something that me and Christine talked a fair amount about. So I've kind of started with Ruberg and Phillips' approach to queerness as a position of existing differently, where both the physical queer body and queerness as an ethereal concept work to trouble and reshape norms. And so I've kind of introduced affect here to examine the meaning made through experiences of playing video games to provide insight into the inequalities that persist in contemporary capitalism and contemporary gaming. So the first place I kind of started looking at affect was the effective relations circulating through queerness in video games through players' active resistance to binary classifications of male or female, where when you first open Pioneers of Olive Town, the player is able to immediately customize their appearance through simple yet non-gendered categories found in the character builder. The player has a choice between a number of face types, skin colors, etc. And these options are separated into broad categories that consist of all available options to the game unrestricted by the character's gender, where the individual is easily able to play queerly when physical traits are not tied to specific genders in character builders, where this is where queer reading kind of comes in, where the individual has the opportunity to insert queerness when there's a lack of representation through queer reading, queer performance, and gender play, where in conversation with others who play this game, you can choose to appear very feminine with he, him pronouns or having long hair while wearing the stereotypical masculine outfit, or you can just generally trouble social norms through it. But despite Pioneers of Olive Town allowing players to customize queerness through the avatar, there's no actual non-binary gender pronouns available. And even though the customizations options are not restricted by gender, the language used to describe character traits, like the more feminine, like cute voice versus like the powerful voice, circulate feelings of femininity or affect of femininity, where Pioneers of Olive Town offers non-binary character customization options that foster identification with avatars, but it relies on the player to actively include queerness.
I'm only thinking about this game because I'm playing it currently, but Tiny Tina's Wonderland has, I think, instead of male, female, it's this one or that one, and then you can choose the pronouns of your character as well, which I really like. You said something there about like queer readings when there's a lack of representation. I'm just wondering if, and I would open this to both of you, and this also might sound like a really silly question, so absolutely shoot this down if it is. But do you think there is the potential to queer representation in video games?
I think that's a very interesting question, and kind of I feel lends to the last presentation on
But this is what I'm thinking of.
trans.
Yeah,
Or, yeah, and where trans representation isn't always included in like queer game studies. And I think there's a lot of room to push queer game studies further, where um, we can move past like we've argued that there's a lack of representation, but there's room to keep pushing the conversation farther as we conceptualize queerness as a position of existing differently, and that so I think there's still room to dismantle binaries within heteronormative spaces or queer spaces and open up queerness to a more flowing definition.
excellent, thank you. And also, Christine, that question, but I'm also just looking at the chat. Can you confirm that it's the Trespasser DLC?
Yeah, it's Trespasser. But yes, so sort of building on that, and this is kind of a wall we started to hit when we were talking about this together, in terms of Rachel and I having discussions. It's sort of an interesting thing, and it's part of the reason that I wanted to bring Lovelink into this conversation a bit as well, because Lovelink puts players in a position where they're effectively treated as non-binary. You can model an avatar and you have a lot of options with that, but you never really pick pronouns and you never really pick a gender, and you're consistently treated as genderless as you're navigating the game. Which is a very interesting thing, but also ends up making players feel like they're very limited in that expression, like I was talking about a moment ago, where physical world identities aren't quite translating even in this context of having explicitly or deliberately queer content. So there's this other hurdle that we're now encountering where you have games where players are largely responsible for their own queer experience. They can dress their characters differently. They can play the game in very specific ways. They can kind of circumvent some of those heteronormative or just generally normative structures that end up being replicated in video games. But when you have a game that's trying to alter or flip that, you also have people who end up encountering this issue of feeling like my sexuality isn't being represented because of these new limitations in this queer content, or my gender identity isn't really coming across and I can't express that, you know, I'm part of this very specifically lesbian romance in this game and as part of my experience. And that creates new discomforts and sort of puts us in a different position where people are still being constricted and constrained in the things that they can explore and express as part of games, but in a very different way than a lot of what we've been dealing with so far in queer game studies. Not sure if that addressed your question.
No, I think it does. Yeah, no, thank you. There's also a question in the chat that I thought was quite interesting. I think, as you were saying, like stuff from the previous talks is kind of being fed in. Could there also be a consideration of asexual representation being further misrepresented by the historic considerations of non-heteronormativity being sexual deviance?
Yeah. I also like I'm gonna go on a tangent. I'm sorry. It's another really interesting thing about Cole and Cole's representation in Dragon Age Inquisition. And I know that there are some games that have done this a little bit better. We have so few representations of asexual characters in video games, but like Pavarti in Outer Worlds is a more positive example, but this one was interesting just because of how BioWare sort of gave and then took away and the players' perceptions of that. But Cole is also sort of interesting because he's perceived as a monster or a demon by most of the other characters in the game. And so you do have this otherness and this othering that happens to this character, at least prior to that shift in the DLC. And it's sort of reinforcing a lot of these misunderstandings and a lot of these tensions around ideas of asexuality, because most of the characters that you encounter as the player, they're trying to tell you to send him away. They're telling you that they're uncomfortable with him. And that reflects a lot of the tensions and misunderstandings that we still have around things like aromanticism or asexuality in society, where people don't really know what to do with that. And even for the few characters that treat Cole as a person, they still define him as something that needs to be studied and understood, something that is odd, or someone who's going to ultimately change, which, as we know, the developers seem to agree with that contention. But these are some of the kinds of struggles that we see with these representations, where they're still pulling in those discomforts and tensions and misunderstandings, and just perhaps subconsciously representing them through difficulties or discomforts among characters within the narrative.
Yeah, thank you. I have two more questions for you both. My first one would be, is there any either current or maybe in an ideal future representations of asexuality or representations of non-binary identity? What does this involve? How do you see it as being affirmative? What could be improved? So on and so forth. Rachel, if you want to start.
Yeah, I don't have a specific example that I'll give you here, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about affect and what affect offers to video games, which is found in the, like, affect offers to video games is found in the counternormative experiences that are created despite the heteronormativity that is inscribed in games. So if we refuse to desire heteronormativity through queer gaming methods, like we talked about, the queer player works to define queer feelings as a form of disobedience to the norm, where in this instance, Pioneers of Olive Town is not completely removed from heteronormativity, but the effective potential of queer can blur these boundaries between normal and not normal by imagining differently despite the persistence of these rigid categories. Affect offers the analysis of the in-between of debates on inclusion versus exclusion of diversity that can contribute to a little point I can give here, where players can employ queer thinking and queer gaming to counter heteronormative structures, but queerness is also already circulating in games despite the heteronormative parameters that influence queer resistance playing. By situating queerness as an evolving concept of the resistance to binary classifications, broadens gender nonconformity in video games not to be an analysis of gender identity, but an analysis of gender dualisms. If that answers your question. So it's like a little bit more than just.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And Christine?
Yeah, and I do want to add that I agree with the previous presenters as well. Like, we are seeing huge shifts in content, and we are seeing more people from LGBTQ communities, queer backgrounds, experiences, and identities making games, which is shifting what we're actually seeing as part of the games. I think that we have a semi-long road forward for AAA games. The indie space is a lot better about incorporating this kind of representation. But you do see, like, recently there was just an update to The Sims 4 where you can now put your pronouns in, which has created some oddities with people putting their own strange pronouns in as part of it and sort of playing around with that idea. But we are seeing movement in AAA companies. For example, like with Inquisition, although they kind of missed the mark with asexuality, they did bring trans writers into the writing room to try to make Krem a better character and a more fully fleshed out character as a trans man. And so I think it's baby steps forward, and we are seeing those shifts happen, and things will continue to get better, but we're still seeing a lot of influence right now from those very difficult to push past cultural conceptualizations, assumptions, and stereotypes. So I think that that's kind of the space that we're in. Things are changing. We will see better and more representation as we move forward, and we're seeing that happen in real time. But breaking totally free of a lot of those cultural emphases is going to be a slow process.
Yeah, I can understand that. My last question then, because I'm particularly feeling encouraged by PS's talk on trans power. So I'm thinking in terms of asexual identity, non-binary identity. Do you think that there is the potential for a space to either exist or be carved out, such as non-binary power or asexual power? What would that look like? It might be a bit out there, to be fair, but I just thought it would be a nice thing to end on an affirmative note. What would that look like? What would be involved? What would that play look like in video games?
I don't have a specific answer here for what it would look like, but I think I'd attend to what it already looks like. I'm tentative to like only push for non-binary power, because that too is like it's like if we asked the game Pioneers of Olive Town to add a third gender option, non-binary, that still is systematically classifying bodies. It's a step in the right direction, but it still works on this binary assumption that all identities are classifiable. So I think the circulation of queerness as a feeling in itself is a resistance that can be employed through everyday activities as we queer the status quo. And to recenter queerness in gaming and decenter heteronormativity, queer gaming demands more than binary logic. And I think that this is starting to open up in some different areas. And just as the overall discourse shifts, the common sense of what is normal versus what is abnormal is no longer a question of like one versus the other. It's kind of like a sphere. There's a lot of different abnormalities and normalities that refuse to be classified.
I'm just immediately thinking that what I'm getting from what you're saying is that we need to stop tending towards the gay male existence and just go non-binary all the way with just queer theory in general. Do it that way, just take over the whole thing. Christine, your own thoughts?
I think, and one of the sort of contentions that I've been struggling with through the discussions for this roundtable and just in general is everyone is always sort of working within and fighting against and constrained by game design. And so I do agree with Rachel on this idea that yes, you can pop in a third potential gender so that people can play with identity in more ways than the binary allows for, but you're still putting players in a position where a lot of the onus for queer play is on them, and it's also defined and constrained by what is available to them in the video game. So you have people who can have headcanons, for example, and experience asexuality or non-binary existence that way, and in a lot of ways those options have been celebrated. But I think that to a pretty large degree, it doesn't go far enough. It is that opt-in experience. It is putting players in the position where if they want that specific expression, they have to make it for themselves. And so I do think that having, even if it's not for the player to embody those identities as part of their play experience, having examples of characters that are non-binary or asexual in a way that's not like hitting the player over the head with it, so to speak, but is just subtly incorporated as part of that experience, like an organic conversation about identity and experience. I think that does a lot more than letting players categorize themselves in particular ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely does. And I'm even thinking about, let's say, game mechanics where I'm thinking of Mass Effect just because Steph is here, but the idea that a romantic relationship needs to be sexual, maybe bringing that in as like an option, as it were, just as like an immediate thought to what you're saying. But I'm sure there can be far more diverse and nuanced ways of approaching it than just that. But as a last note, I just wanted to say thank you both very much for your time here. I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion. And if you want to pop your details in where people can find you, I'm sure there are people who'd be interested in seeing what you get up to with your respective research. All right.